Welcome to the Lawyering Peace podcast series, where we explore the art of diplomacy, the practice of peace building, and the legal, political, and historical frameworks that underpin peace and security. I am so excited today to welcome Dr. Łukasz Adamski. Łukasz, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Paul, for the invitation. It's really a privilege for me to have this opportunity to share some of my thoughts with you and with English-speaking audience.
Well, fantastic. So for the benefit of our audience, I'm your host, Paul Williams, the founder and president of the Public International Law and Policy Group, and the Rebecca Grazier Professor of Law and International Relations at American University. Now, today's episode continues our discussion on paradigm shifts, where we ask leading thinkers and practitioners to reflect on whether we are witnessing the emergence of a new world order and what that transformation might mean for peace, stability, and order around the globe. Dr. Adamski is a historian and political scientist specializing in the history of Eastern Europe with particular expertise in Polish-Ukrainian and Polish-Russian relations, as well as the foreign and domestic policy of East European states. Now, since 2022, he has served as the deputy director of the, I'm going to try my pronunciation as best I can here, Łukasz, the Julius Mieroszewski Dialogue Centre, and the editor-in-chief of the AREI Journal for Central and Eastern European History and Politics. He is also the author and editor of numerous scholarly works on Polish political thought and the complex historical relationships among Poland, Ukraine, and Russia. Łukasz is also a colleague of mine on the independent working group advising President Zelenskyy and his team on the Ukrainian peace process. Łukasz, it's a real pleasure to have you with us today, and I'm very much looking forward to drawing on your historical perspective as we think through this moment of global transition. So again, thank you for joining us.
Thank you once again for invitation.
Before we kick off onto the deeper, heavy thinking questions that I have for you, I want to hear a little bit about your personal journey. When did you wake up and decide, I want to dedicate my life to thinking about studying Eastern European history and political thought? And were there any experiences early in your career that really shaped how you approach thinking about the situation in Eastern Europe and how you're thinking about Ukraine today?
I was all the time interested in politics, in Polish domestic politics and in international politics. But even as a teenager, I understood that you cannot understand politics without deep knowledge of history. Because basically, politics is about history. Let's say 70-80% of current political discussion are discussion about history, about what happened earlier. It's even not my words, but the words of the person you try to pronounce, because this person is in the name of my institution, Juliusz Mieroszewski, brilliant Polish political thinker. Now I understand that politics is also about psychology, but at that time I thought that it's mainly about history. And on that way, I started also to read as much as possible about history. And Polish history, the history of my country, is actually history of Polish relations with its eastern neighbors, Ukrainian, Lithuanians, Belarusians, because several hundred years, actually, all those four contemporary nations created one state, federal state, Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. It's also about Russia, because Russia was heavily present in the Polish history, and it was the country actually which actually deprived Poland its sovereignty in the end of 18th century. It was also about Germany, not because of the Second World War, and also because of earlier history, where Prussia and Austria being treated at the time also as German state, also partitioned my country. So on that way, I started to realize the whole this complexity of Central and Eastern European history. And if you ask me about let's say events in my life which deeply affected me, I think it was 2002, 2003 when I spent a whole year in Germany, in Berlin. At the time, I was absolutely interested in the German language, German culture, the German history, German politics. And then after this year in Germany, I actually became much more interested in Eastern European history, in Russian, Ukrainian affairs, in Belarus, and also affairs. I met many students from those countries who studied in Berlin, and against the German background, I think those Eastern European history appeared to me much more appealing. So because of my stay in Germany, I started to be Eastern European historian. And then I continued this career actually till the current time.
Okay, so basically you found the Germans a bit boring. No surprise there.
Thank you that it was you who said it, not me. But indeed, it was so. That Germany was absolutely predictable and to a certain extent boring compared to what was happening in Eastern Europe at the time.
Well, we have a question further down in the podcast about the rearmament of Germany and its repositioning of itself within the European Union and whether it's still going to be boring. But before we get to that, let's pick up in 1945. So let's use your historical acumen and walk us through when you look back at the international order that emerged initially after World War II and then went through a bit of an evolution after the end of the Cold War in 1989. How would you characterize it? And particularly from the perspective of Central and Eastern Europe, and the 45 to 89 is one particular point, and then 90 forward is another point. In your view, was this a stable, rules-based, values-based system that came to incorporate Central and Eastern Europe, or was it the projection of power and authority by superpowers just in a legal hierarchy?
Look, it could have not been stable because this order was neither legal, even from the point of international law existing at that time. The UN Charter was already adopted. It was unjust because it left a significant part of the world, sovereign nations, at least officially recognized as sovereign nations, under the so-called zone of Soviet influence. And the fact of this order divided Europe and later also other parts of the world into two big blocks. So this order was very remote from this vision which the people who created UN Charter had. It was, of course, a vision of with certain hint of realism because it predicted that five big countries, five superpowers, will have more obligations in protecting international peace than other participants of international relations. But anyway, the vision of this order was that there should be no aggressive wars, and if they happen, they should be penalized. And international community should restore law and order. Then this vision also assumed that the principle of sovereign equality will be dominant in international relations. And what does it mean, sovereign equality? It means that every participant of international relations has the same rights and the same obligations. So there are no equal and more equals. And then this vision also assumed that, let me characterize in the following way, that countries have a right to decide over its own internal development, and no foreign powers can impose a government unto a sovereign nation. What happened actually, and it's basic principles of the UN Charter. And what happened, for example, in Yalta? Usually we think about Yalta as conference of three big powers, conference of the leaders of those three big powers who decided over the fate of Germany. And it can be understood because Germany was, let's say, the enemy of humankind, of humanity. Then it capitulated unconditionally in May 1945. But those three powers also decided what should be borders in Europe without consultations with the population interested. And in the case of Poland, which is very, let's say, striking, they decided which government Poland should have. Poland, look, in February 1945, Poland had its own government, internationally recognized and residing in London. This government, according to the Polish constitution, had a full authority over the Polish troops, which had been fighting against the German troops without any breaks from 1939. Poland had its own president residing in London. And then one of those big powers, so Stalin, decided to install in the area of Poland, which was already liberated by the Red Army, its own committee, so puppet government. And Great Britain and the United States decided that this government should be a basis for, let's say, national unity government in future Poland, and the role of the Polish president was absolutely ignored. Let's say the practice of this word order, which appeared in 1945, was from the very beginning fundamentally contradictory to the principles enshrined. And I think that it was this, let's say, the wrong assumption and wrong hopes which Mr. Churchill and Mr. Roosevelt especially had with regards to the Stalin's intention. It was one of the reasons, or perhaps even the biggest reason, why several years later, so-called Cold War broke out. It was this disappointment how the Polish question was solved in 1945, and disappointment that Stalin ignored his own promise and Polish communists falsified elections. So perhaps I'm talking too much about Poland, but my point is that this world order, which started to exist in 1945, was from the very, very beginning violated. The rules of this order were violated by people who invented them, actually. And for many nations in Eastern Europe, and then later in other parts of the world, this order was perhaps ostensibly stable, but de facto it was so unjust that it could not provide long-term stability. Long-term, I mean stability which should be counted not in years, but in dozens of years.
Well, Lucas, let me follow up on that. In 1989, 1990, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, the dissolution of the former Soviet Union, how did that impact? Was that the evolution of the world order? Did we move in the direction of a more legal-based, rules-based, idealism, values-based, or same old world order, just one superpower instead of two?
There's no problem with one superpower or even with five superpowers. The problem is if those superpowers have this tendency to violate rules which they themselves actually created. And from my perspective, let's say the 1990s was the period where the hopes emerged that the international law should be a long-term basis for a stable world order. Perhaps 1999 and bombardment of Serbia, which was regarded, at least by Russia, but also in other parts of the world, as a certain sign that this this liberal, let's say, world order is also a manifestation of US hegemony or NATO hegemony. But anyway, I think if we compare this period with what happened in after 2014, after the annexation of Crimea, not to say with everything which occurred during the Cold War, I think that was the period where, let's say, those hopes for just and stable world order existed and flourished. And perhaps later we understood that this is a certain illusion, because if we would like to have really stable world, liberal democratic world order, then we have to invest much more resources in upholding this system. And many countries were not ready to adopt those rules, so they felt themselves obliged to sign international human rights pacts, but they were not inclined to. They didn't want actually to respect those rules. But anyway, I think this period was a period of hope. What happened later was, let's say, perhaps a return of certain. I don't want to say realism, because it's a bad word for what I wanted to say, but it's rather certain sober assessment that the humanity is not ready to implement rules that it adopted.
Well, Lucas, let me pick up on that a little bit with that historical perspective and the experience of Poland from 1945 to 89, and then 89 to 99, and before 2014. How is Poland, how are your Polish colleagues, intellectuals and others, looking at the current shift in the global paradigm? If you click on the internet and it's everything from, yeah, no, same old, to, OMG, this is a dramatic shift, rules-based, values-based, power-based realism. What is the frame of reference you're using to analyze the so-called shift? And then the second part is, what do you see it shifting into? What does this new paradigm? What are the contours of this new paradigm?
Look, first of all, what is the most important for every nation? It's security. Huh? So if you ask me from what perspective me or my colleagues analyze those developments, it's the perspective from Polish national interest and Polish security. And Poland is, let's say, is sometimes considered to be an emerging middle power or half middle power, but anyway, it's not big power, and it's also not a small country. And from Polish perspective, the best guarantor of Polish security is international law and alliances. And the belief that security guarantees which we have as a member of the EU and as a member of the of NATO are effective, so, or they will be effective if, let's say, if something happens. Yeah. So what we see now is the diminishing belief that those security guarantees are something substantially bigger than security guarantees which France and Great Britain offered to Poland in 1939. And indeed, okay, they declared war against Germany, but they provided no effective assistance to Poland in September 1939. And this is a deep trauma in Poland. So what we see now is actually this diminishing belief that international law and security guarantees offered to us will be effective. And therefore, we see with, let's say, disappointment, or if not with anxiety, what's happening. We see that Russia not violated not only international treaties, but it violated basic norms of international law. So ban on annexation, and ban to use force in order to settle international disputes. We see that there is a growing appetite to legalize, at least, let's say, annexation of Crimea. We see, let's say, the discussion about Greenland, which also led to anxiety in Poland and to the perception that perhaps we overestimated the role of alliances with the US because everything is changing. So now what we see is that this vision of Polish security, basing on the belief that the international law and alliances will work, is waning. And Poland has to invest much more financial means in its own army. Perhaps even there is a debate whether Poland should perhaps in future acquire nuclear weapon. It is not. It is not expressed publicly. Usually, it's not expressed, but such conversation, at least such conversation, are being held among Polish experts. So it shows actually the tendency, which is really embarrassing, and it's this tendency shows also the feeling of uncertainty in the world.
Well, let's unpack that a little bit and get down into the specifics, because you're an excellent guest to help us map the historical arc of this evolution or dilution of this world order. Oftentimes folks nowadays will say, "Oh, did you see Prime Minister Carney's speech at Davos? And now there's a pivot in the world order." And others will say, "Well, no. Did you see the elections in the United States? This pivot happened a year ago, January." But then still others will roll it back and say, no, this happened in with Russia's war of aggression against Europe and Ukraine in 2022, February. And then others, like you've just mentioned, is no, this new world order started to pivot and come into being in 2014, not only when Russia invaded Crimea, but when the world was like, oh, shame on you. You shouldn't have done that. Okay, now let's get back to talking about whatever else we're interested in, and didn't really push back on Russia. So where would you mark as the beginning of this pivot of the world order? And what is it pivoting towards? From your comments, less law-based, less reliable alliance-based. But when did it start? Where is it headed? And what's it going to look like? Easy question.
It's not an easy question. It's a question for the whole lecture. As I said, perhaps I will begin with certain not obvious observation for audience which is not familiar with Polish affairs. But actually, look, if we try to find certain idea in the history of Poland, something which would unite, let's say, tradition of Middle Ages, of early modern period and 21st century. This is the idea of anti-imperialism. In the Middle Ages, Poland opposed, let's say, the tendency of hegemony in Europe by Holy Roman Empire. Then it opposed a tendency of absolutism in Western Europe and also in Russia. But then in the 19th century, in the period where Poland was deprived of its own statehood, Polish thinkers, Polish intellectuals coined the idea of a new, better European order, which would end wars between European nations and European states. And this order should base on the, let's say, on the dignity of every nation to decide itself over its own fate. And after 1989, after Poland regained its sovereignty, there was this perception that finally and especially after Poland became a NATO member and the EU member, that finally we live in the perhaps not ideal world, but in the world which bases on this idea that every nation is sovereign and can decide sovereignly over its own fate. And Poland decided to be a member of the EU, and now you ask me about the development. We see that the tendency to supremacy or imperial hegemony are present in the world and even within the EU, that the principle of equality of all EU members is very often violated. It was actually French President Jacques Chirac who gave us the lesson, I think, in 2002, 2003, that Poland missed the opportunity to be silent, and it should shut up. It was actual words. Yeah, perhaps this is a confrontation of idealistic approach with the, let's say, reality. Yeah? But we see that those tendency to hegemony and to have at least certain elements of imperialism in international relations are still there, and this is what causes anxiety uh, among Polish experts. It also it is a matter of political discussion in Poland. There we have a president, Karol Nawrocki, who is perceived as very pro-American. Then we have a Prime Minister, Donald Tusk, who is perceived as being very pro-European. We don't know whether being good member of the EU and being a good ally of the US, those two options might be reconciled. We see that it might arise even bigger problems, tension between the EU as whole and the US. And this discussion where the world order, where the security order, European order will evolve are very present in Poland, and it are also a matter of internal political disputes. But where actually we are heading to, no one knows. There is a perception that the role of international law is unfortunately diminishing. There is a perception that in future we will have perhaps even more conflicts because states are now encouraged to invest more in its own security, and there is a perception that perhaps the role of the US and Europe simultaneously will diminish in the future world. It means that we'll have a competition of various actors, various middle big powers, and as a result we'll get chaos instead of order.
Łukasz, speaking of chaos, let's talk a little bit about the European Union and what its future might look like. It's faced with a number of choices, a number of tensions, a number of stress points. There's, I like to, I refer to as Russia's war of aggression against Europe and Ukraine. There's a bit of this, as you say, imperialism tendencies within the European Union. It has these bizarre configurations. The leaders are the E3, which is France, Germany, and the UK, which chose to leave the European Union. But now you keep hearing the E3. There's a desire for strategic autonomy. Today in the Wall Street Journal, there was an op-ed by Boris Johnson, the former Prime Minister of the UK, basically challenging Europe to step up and say, look, Europe, you say you need strategic autonomy. You do. Put troops on the ground in Ukraine. Germany, give the Taurus missiles to the Ukrainians, let them strike, confiscate the frozen assets. You've frozen them, now seize them. And if you're not going to do that, you're not going to be a serious global power or even serious middle power. So there's so much tension around and within Europe. How is that going to play out? And is Europe going to emerge as one of the poles in a multipolar world? Is Europe going to become a superpower? It's a little embarrassing when people say, oh yeah, America, China, and Russia. It's like, whoa, wait a second. The European Union should come way before Russia when you're talking about superpowers, but it doesn't. So help our audience understand Europe.
Look, there's one fundamental difference between Europe or the European Union and countries you named, China, US, and India. So there is no European public opinion. There is no one single European nation. The EU is a sort of confederation of sovereign nations. And if it is so, and if it's the nations of Europe which are, let's say, the bearer of sovereignty, then they will not give up their right to elect their own government, and because of its own tradition, history, and this huge sense of diversity, I think European nations, European states, are deemed to be simply a confederation of European states. And if it, of course, affects negatively the ability to act as global power, because if the EU would like to act in that way, it should, let's say, be more, at least more united. If not to have one united foreign policy, it should have one European army, and it should be all agreed between European nations. So how to do it without federalization, I don't know. I think it is simply not possible, at least now. Perhaps in 50 years, when let's say social society will change, and perhaps mentality will change, it would be possible. But I think now the perception that it's not Europe as such, but various nations. So nations by nations, I understand even not only states, but as nation, I understand those, let's say, cultural and political communities which arose in Europe throughout the last 1,000 years. Now they are too strong to have Europe as a federation. And without federalization of Europe, I think there will be no single European army. There will be no single European foreign policy, because those elements are indispensable when we think about sovereignty. And without that, either European politicians would be able to find very talented, skilled way to manage the structure, and perhaps it would indeed enable a bigger role of the European Union on the global stage, or they will fail, and I think they will fail, and it means that, unfortunately, that Europe's role in the world would be not as strong as perhaps many American friends of us and many Polish people would like to have. So here I'm a little bit pessimistic, but I don't know simply, I don't know how to change either mentality of politicians or mentality of people. Because if you would like to have a stronger Europe, you should have a very responsible government or one single European public opinion, so de facto one single European nations. And such processes takes times. It can take many dozens of years, if not hundreds of years, to merge European nations into one community. Like let's say the Chinese did it, perhaps India did it, the US did it, but not Europe.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting challenge that the Europeans face without a federal system. Let's pick up a little bit on Germany, because there was always this sense of Germany being an outsized economic power within Europe. And there was great anxiety about the reunification. Now we all celebrate the reunification of Germany, but at the time, Margaret Thatcher, others were very anxious about Germany becoming an outsized economic power. But it was okay because they weren't particularly powerful militarily. The Americans had the bases and the troops in Germany under the NATO arrangements. But now Germany is, I don't want to say rearming, but it's doubling down on its armament. Now Poland is already doing 5% of its GDP and has the greatest contribution of any NATO member state, even than the United States, of its GDP to its defense. The Germans are catching up. And I've been surprised that almost instantaneously there's public commentary expressing anxiety about this. I'm just curious if you're sensing that anxiety of a more militarized Germany back to conscription.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to overstate this, but there's a bit of a thread of, we kind of liked when the Germans weren't spending their 2% on defense.
Yeah. Okay, let's say historical experience, memory, and also uncertainty about future of Germany should incline Polish experts and Polish politicians to think about Germany also as possible potential threat. We don't know how, let's say, the situation in Germany would evolve if far-right nationalistic parties will be indispensable part of future government, future coalition in Germany. And it might happen quite soon. But currently, I think most, at least Polish politicians and public opinion, do not consider Germany as a military threat. Even more, there is the the feeling that stronger Germany, military stronger Germany, would increase Polish security also. Polish military is definitely now stronger than German Bundeswehr. At the time being, there is not this perception that Germany might pose a military threat to Poland, but we cannot exclude it in future. Because no, everything can happen. What many people in Poland are afraid of is not stronger Germany. And it's not Germany which is more keen to provide military support to Ukraine, more keen to invest in its defense capacities. But many Poles, especially with conservative views or nationalistic views, it's not the same, of course, but are afraid of the German tendency to hegemonize the European Union. Germany, as a biggest country of the EU, is also a country which is needed to actually to implement all possible EU policies which the EU countries would like to implement. But German politicians have tendency not to say much about German national interest, but they often repeat that German national interest is to have strong Europe. We have to invest more in the EU. We have to Europeanize everything possible, and Germany would incline other countries also to reform the EU, to invest more in the EU in the interest of European integration, and so on and so forth. And this. In this narrative, the role of German own interest is very often deliberately omitted, and all those interests are presented as they are European interests. So this tendency allows many observers to conclude that Germany would like to, let's say, to hegemonize Europe and to govern Europe through its influence and in Brussels through European institutions. Let's say the very fact that the head of European Commission is a German politician, Ursula von der Leyen, only strengthen those sentiments or those fears. I considered myself to be rather opponent of people who think that Germany is a threat for Europe, for Poland. I think quite contrary. German cooperation is indispensable to provide more Polish inputs and more Polish experience also in German way of thinking, in European way of thinking about Eastern Europe, so Brussels way of thinking. I think the year 2022 also persuaded many German politicians and experts that it's not a German expertise, but a rather Polish expertise on Russia, which appeared to be the right one. So let's say those expertise which perceived Russia as threat, not as a chance. But anyway, I think that Poland and Germany would remain neighbors, and as neighbors, we are simply doomed to cooperate. So I personally, I'm a little bit skeptical about German, let's say, those narratives which are very skeptical about Germany. But on the other hand, this development of the situation in Germany and increase of far right perhaps give certain boost to arguments of those German skeptical forces. So it's. Anyway, this question of Germany's role in Europe is very complex. Definitely, European Union cannot exist without Germany being embedded in European structures. But too much tendency to perceive the EU as imperial project, not as a confederation of national states, I think would only be detrimental to the effectiveness of the EU, and it would boost all those skeptics, which I have just named.
Lucas, one of the impetus for the rearmament of Germany is Russia's war of aggression, the situation in Ukraine, the need to not only provide more assistance to Ukraine, but also defend against future Russian aggression against against Europe. Is the European Union capable, and should it rapidly bring Ukraine into the European Union?
The EU can do it only if European European countries agreed to introduce, say, membership of the second category. I'm sorry to be so frank and open, but I think that right now, politically, it would be almost impossible to enlarge the European Union and to adopt Ukraine as a member of the EU during the war of Russia against Ukraine, and without the period where Ukraine would be able to change the way how the Ukrainian state is functioning. I mean, it has to really to show other governments in the EU that Ukraine is ready to fulfill Copenhagen criteria, so that it has an economy which would be able to withstand competitive pressure of other EU economies. Then rule of law and democratic procedures are deeply anchored in Ukraine, and that so-called acquis communautaire. So this is the part of the law which is common for all European states is implemented or will be implemented without problems in Ukraine. So to persuade the government of the European Union that Ukraine is ready to the membership, this would require a huge work of Ukrainian politicians, of Ukrainian diplomats, and several reforms in Ukraine, which are really hard to be implemented in the face of war. Let's say in the most optimistic scenario, I think EU can accept Ukraine as full member, let's say in 8-10 years, but it's really in very optimistic scenario. But on the other hand, not only me, but I think many European politicians understand that Ukraine cannot be left in, let's say, in certain gray zone between EU and Russia. That it would create also a huge risk for European countries. So Ukraine has to be into Europe, has to be integrated with the European Union, but without giving them full membership. So what would be the option? Simply to perhaps to offer Ukrainian people certain privileges the EU citizens have, like freedom of movement, freedom of work, freedom of financial flows between the European Union and Ukraine. Ukraine perhaps can join the custom union with the European Union, like Turkey did it many dozens years ago. Perhaps Ukraine can also enjoy security guarantees, which every member of the EU has. And it can be, so what I just called, it can be somehow packed and sold, and so it can be sold to the public opinion as a membership of Ukraine in the EU, but de facto it would be legally a second a membership of second sort. It would be simply Ukraine would not receive access to the internal European decision-making process, and Ukraine would be prevented from participation in certain common European policies. And if we decided on this scenario, and let's say if there is a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine, then I think such membership can be possible to imagine within 2-3 years. And last but not least, remember that if we want to support Ukraine, and if we want that the process of European accession of Ukraine would end positively, then we have to also to have in mind that every enlargement of the EU has to be ratified in all European Union's member states, so in 27 parliaments. In France, probably it should be also be a subject of a referendum, national referendum. So even if politicians would like to give Ukraine much more privileges than I just drafted, so a real membership, it can be blocked simply by one or two European member states, like for example France and the Netherlands blocked the European Constitution in 2005. So we cannot be too optimistic, and we should not hurry up European politicians too strongly, because as a result we can get something that we want to avoid. So Ukraine in the EU, yes, in after it meets all criteria. Ukraine should do this homework. It can do after the war ends, and if it receives certain help, financial assistance, if Ukrainian politicians would be reasonable and responsible, but it would require, let's say, 10 years, I think. Perhaps a little bit less, but with ratification, I think 10 years. Earlier, yes, but it would be a second class membership, and such membership should also be somehow legally introduced in the European legal system to European treaties, which might be also an obstacle, because now we have only full membership or no membership at all.
Lucas, you've been very generous with your time. I just have two more questions.
Yeah, simply
Although I'm still processing it's going to take a decade for Ukraine to become a member of the EU or some type of second track.
But one decade, not more, but 1 decade. This is, I think, this perspective.
It may actually become a member of NATO before it becomes a member of the
it's
European
true. Yeah, the hurdle is much lower than the hurdle to become a NATO member. It's much it's easier to do than the member of the EU.
Just ask Montenegro and a few of our other friends in the neighborhood.
Exactly.
I want to ask you a question about artificial intelligence. Now, I know your specialty is history and international relations, but I also know you're also very tech savvy. And one of the things we're seeing, two dimensions of this. One is in the conflict, in Russia's war of aggression against Europe and Ukraine, we're seeing the massive deployment of artificial intelligence on the battlefield, both for defensive as well as for offensive. And then completely separately from that, we're seeing as some would say, the tsunami impact of artificial intelligence on the global economy. And it's happening at 5x, 10x speed. And at the same time, it's basically China and the United States, which have the compute, have the energy, have the frontier labs, have the trained LLMs and even the SLMs to be doing this. Europe is intensely reliant upon American technology software and especially on AI as well. How is Europe going to both economically and militarily survive this dramatic evolution of AI? We talk about the evolving world order, rules-based, law-based, values-based, et cetera, but there's an equally rapid evolution of the world economic order based on artificial intelligence. Some good, some bad, but how is and will Europe be able to successfully position itself to capitalize on and or survive?
Well, this question is excellent, but it's really hard to answer, really, because an honest answer requires saying that I think politicians are incapable to predict the future development of artificial intelligence and how rapid it is. They understand that without participation in this race, the European Union will be behind the US and China. But I think they underestimate the rapid development of this technology and how it changed our behaviors, our functioning. I understand definitely that Chinese politicians, US engineers, US politicians understand that they have to invest more and more in this technology, not only because of this value of this technology itself, but also because of military threat which would emerge if, let's say, China would receive upper hand above the US in artificial intelligence. But how artificial intelligence would change functioning of the United States, I don't know whether there is such debate. How it would change mentality of people, the way of how people are educated. Recently, I read analysis that perhaps lawyers would earn much less because most of tasks which are now carried out by lawyers would be done by artificial intelligence. So I think we have a very honest answer is that we are in a situation that everyone knows that the artificial intelligence is a revolution, that it would change, if not everything, then much, and that and Europe is in a worse position than China and US because it is not as advanced as US and China in development of this technology. Perhaps there will be certain political consent to invest more in Europe in let's say digital sovereignty, let's say. But whether it ultimately change the position of the EU with regards to US and China, I don't know, because I don't know how this technology where it evolves. Look, whether it would be eventually positive for humanity or negative, or perhaps it would only make emotions processes which would bring us back into the past, to the Stone Age era. I don't know. So it's hard to read. Excellent questions, but it's hard to answer. And I don't know that you. I understand that you don't expect the response, but I don't know how to answer. But I'm, as you mentioned, I'm, let's say, historian. I'm perhaps active in the intellectual sphere. I'm foreign policy analyst, but I'm not politician, so I don't have to care about my public perception and have no objections to admit that I don't know where this technology would bring us.
Well, Lucas, the reason why I ask you that question is I want you to stay up at night thinking about it and wondering what the answer might really be. And then as you and I meet each other in Brussels and in the Netherlands in our subsequent working group meetings, we can go back and forth on this question because it's a question that keeps me up at night as well. And our listeners on the podcast.
No, look, for example, now I think you have no illusion that you speak to me, yeah? But perhaps in 10 years, you will be obliged to identify me, it's really me, Łukasz Adamski, and not my avatar, my digital avatar. So
my avatar is going to call your avatar and they'll sort out a time for you and I to have coffee. And they'll be doing all the work. So it'll be okay. We'll have a universal high income. Well, Lucas, let me ask you one last question. And this is the key takeaway question. What do you want our listeners to have in their minds when they're thinking about what history tells us about the paradigm shift that we're undergoing at the moment with values-based, rules-based realism or reemergence of a unipolar world, et cetera? What lessons can we learn from history that'll help us think about this shift?
the basic lesson is, I think that history is not development of history is not determined, and in history, the accidental event played a huge significance very often. Let's imagine what would happen, what would have happened if, let's say, not Churchill but someone else led British government in 1940. What would happen if, let's say, if a Polish underground had been successful in attempt to kill Hitler in October 1939 in Warsaw? We can imagine many alternative scenario only if something, one small element would change. So we don't know. We can value probability of certain scenarios in future. We can, and we should invest much in our forecast, in our predictions, but ultimately we should be conscious of the limitation of our knowledge about the future, because this is this lesson from the history. In the history, revolution occurred quite often. There were huge technological revolutions. There were wars. There were uh, inventions which changed the way how humanity was functioning. Perhaps now this question of here about the artificial intelligence is also a manifestation of our joint understanding that we are in the middle of certain revolution, and we don't know, whether to where this revolution would bring us. But we should not be pessimistic about that we don't know something what would happen in future. We should be conscious of our limitation, and we should learn history profoundly to understand human mentality and certain processes which perhaps can repeat, to also perhaps to make our future more predictable. But ultimately, as I said, we have to be aware of the limitation of our cognitive limitation in forecasting future. So this is this lesson from the history.
So no history, no politics, and consult a mystic in order to figure out what comes next. Not exactly what you said, but okay. I'm a Californian.
Okay.
Remember, I'm a Californian. So, mysticism, it plays a little bit of role in everything that
Okay.
everything that I do.
And therefore I appreciate so much our cooperation, Paul.
Well, Lucas, thank you for sharing such thoughtful reflections with us today. It's been a real joy and a real pleasure for me, and I'm sure for our listeners as well, to hear your insights and hear your thinking and your framing about this paradigm shift, and in particular, how the Poland is thinking about this and the broader European community. So thank you, Lucas.
Thank you. Thank you for your hospitality, and thank you for enabling me to share those remarks. Anyway, mm, I think with all limitation which we just discussed through about forecasting, about lessons from the history, one lesson, perhaps one lesson from the Polish history is here worth of being reminded that there are no such conditions where we can desperately say we cannot change it. So even in times which appear to be very gloomy and very depressing, if there's a hope and there's a belief, faith that something can be changed, this belief also motivates us to work more intensively for better future. So this is once more a message which I would like to also to convey. And thank you, Paul. Thank you, and to all your also colleagues for enabling this program.
Lucas, those are wonderful words to end on. And so for our listeners, I just want to thank you for listening and for joining us on this episode of Lawyering Peace. And we will see you next time.